Welcome to our lecture series, Scholarly Writing for Publication. And welcome specifically to this lecture 10, Theory Building Operationalization Phase. If you recall, in lecture 8 and lecture 9, we looked at theory building, but from the conceptualization perspective, or a phase, which is phase number 1. Just to remind you, I did tell you that we've got a number of phases in theory building. And the first phase, if you recall, was actually conceptualize. The second phase is the operationalize phase. The third phase is the confirm. The fourth phase is the apply. And the fifth is refine. So those are the phases that we have in theory building. Now we are handling the second phase of theory building, and then later on, God willing, we shall probably combine the remaining three so that we really get a feel or a sense of how we build theories. As you can see in our lecture 10, ladies and gentlemen, to operationalize a theory, the theory must be expressed in terms of its functional use for the purpose of acceptance or rejection, ladies and gentlemen. So the operationalize phase becomes a logical bridge between the conceptualize and confirm phases, but it also interplays with the apply and refine phases. As you can see on the diagram, or in the diagram that is presented here on the screen, ladies and gentlemen. So the purpose of this lecture is therefore to describe, as you can see on the screen here, the specific approaches to operationalization that serves as an instructive guide. And specifically, this lecture will define the operationalize phase. I will attempt to describe the general inputs of this phase. I will also provide a practical summary of operationalize phase activity, and then describe the outputs of the operationalization phase and propose a set of quality indicators for the operationalize phase, ladies and gentlemen. So those are the aspects that we are going to cover in this lecture. So why don't we start with a clear and a detailed or a detailed understanding of what operationalization is all about. Now, ladies and gentlemen, an applied discipline theory needs to be confirmed or tested in its real world context so as to establish its utility. If you recall from the previous lectures, I told you that a theory, right, is good as its utility. A good theory is that theory that is able to explain reality, right? You are able to capture a greater portions, if possible, cover the entire description of reality out there. So that's why we are concerned with the operationalization, because we want to know the utility of the theory. So the explanation that this new theorizing creates must be examined, assessed in the world to see where it occurs, how it occurs, the various modifications required, and the assumptions that are made. And to confirm a theory, the ideas and the relationships that we've been describing must be converted to what we call observable and confirmable components or elements. So operationalizing theories, ladies and gentlemen, commonly results into what we call hypothesis, empirical indicators, and other claims which are investigated in the confirm phase, ladies and gentlemen. So when we talk about, you go through the conceptualization. After conceptualization, you must operationalize. In other words, you must be able to test, right, the theory, test the model that you have to see its utility, its applicability, right, and find out whether the claims that are made by the theory in terms of hypothesis, in terms of propositions, are valid. And of course, ultimately, as you can see, operationalizing requires the theorist to develop strategies for judging the accuracy and fit of the new theory in the world in which it's expected to function. And that's why this diagram that you see on the screen, which is actually figure 1, is very, very important, ladies and gentlemen. But since you've been seeing this diagram for a very long time, I would rather that we actually remove it, and then we move to another level of understanding and another description, ladies and gentlemen. So the operationalize phase requires connecting the theoretical framework and the world of practice, ladies and gentlemen, and the ideas of being translated or converted to what we call observable components, right? So you no longer need that diagram, as I said, and we need to remove it so that we proceed. But those are the phases: conceptualize, operationalize, confirm, apply, and then refine. So, of course, we need to therefore operationalize. So operationalizing refers to how the concepts or units involved in a theory and the associated relationships are going to be confirmed or measured, ladies and gentlemen. So the confirmation and measuring of these hypotheses become very critical and very important. So the idea of operationalization developed from the works of Bridgman 1922, 1927, and Bentley 1954, who argued that concepts must be made measurable in order to make statements about their accuracy, then takes shape in this particular perspective. And in the social sciences, as we know it, the concept of operationalization usually becomes part of the assessment method and is clearly evident in psychometric evaluation. So that's why you have psychometricians. They spend most of the time developing measures for particular concepts to be tested in certain environments, ladies and gentlemen. So let me just give you an example. Investigators may wish to measure the concept of happiness, right? We know happiness is a concept, but a given participant's degree of happiness is intangible and cannot be directly measured. So investigators might operationalize the concept to include things like tone of voice, facial expressions, gestures, word choice, among other indicators, ladies and gentlemen. However, alternative philosophical orientations require tools other than the scientific method to establish how a proposed explanation will be confirmed empirically. So we, after conceptualizing, we go to that level of measurements, ladies and gentlemen, and measurement is an important aspect, as we have already seen. And this actually takes us to the operationalization, because you cannot measure what you have not operationalized. Therefore, scales, instruments, and inventories are forms of operationalization which are clearly identified in excellent research reports, and some strands of qualitative inquiry also make use of the operationalization concept by stating how research results can be assessed, ladies and gentlemen. So the operationalization level is important after conceptualization, whether you are going to undertake a qualitative perspective or a quantitative perspective. And this is why some qualitative approaches employ hypotheses. So, but we also know, ladies and gentlemen, that other forms of qualitative inquiry, such as phenomenology, generally do not make use of measurement and specifically avoid stating measurement criterion. However, it should be noted at this material time that some authors have attempted to use measurement principles even in phenomenological research, though these efforts are rare, ladies and gentlemen. So, having gone through what operationalization means in this case, and I know you now know, right, from conceptualization you go to operationalization, and then of course what next after that, that is really measurement, and then later on you really go out into the field and assess and of course confirm the theories, right, and of course revise if you want to revise. So you can see that inputs to the operationalization phase are particularly important, and I'll take you through these inputs, ladies and gentlemen. So the inputs from the conceptual phase can direct inputs to the operationalization phase. You remember we had outputs. We looked at the conceptual stage. Conceptual, we had the inputs, we had the various processes in between there, and the outputs, right? Now, the outputs of the conceptual stage actually become inputs to the operationalization phase, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll be showing you a diagram very soon, although not now, for you to appreciate the kind of thing that we are talking about. So a carefully constructed model or system or a set of linked concepts is the basis for operationalization, ladies and gentlemen. So you must have a model, you must have a theoretical model for you to start now operationalizing. So a theorist must have a working set of ideas that explain human and system behavior to engage in translating or converting them into confirmable measures. And it is also reasonable, ladies and gentlemen, for theory investigators to speculate about operationalization components as they get clarified through the various phases. And this may sound a bit sloppy, ladies and gentlemen, but the human mind and the reality of implementation opportunities can have the theory building phases functioning simultaneously or in various sequences. And this is very important because we have to keep careful documentation of whatever we do in this process, because the process must be scientific anyway, and we must have that rigorous and scientific process that can be repeated so that we confirm or probably we disconfirm the results that we get. And we know that several theory building projects have spread over many years. If you're going to really come up with a theory, just a one kind of incident shot is not enough. So you need to really continue testing out, rigorously testing out these theories with a view of revising the theories or disconfirming or even exposing error and dismissing these theories and coming up with the new theories, ladies and gentlemen. And one of the efforts you could focus on could be on any subject or topic of your choice, depending on the experience that you have. And of course, the ideas and the perspectives and the problems that you pick from the managers who go through these things on a daily basis. Let me give you an example, ladies and gentlemen. Some scholars have developed a core model for a theory of performance improvement, calling upon diffusing contributions from various disciplines. For example, borrowing from the psychological discipline or psychology discipline, borrowing from the economics discipline and systems theories, and again putting all these things together to form a theory of performance improvement. And I'll just show you on the screen here, a diagram that represents this kind of approach, right? If you are interested in performance management or performance improvement theory, and you want to put together theory, ladies and gentlemen, and I know that scholars have already done this, right? And you can see that this theory borrows from a number of disciplines, economic discipline, systems, psychology, then you bring the issue of ethics, and of course you look at the organizational processes as presented in the diagram here in this stool, right? This is a three-legged stool, but when you add ethics, of course it becomes a four-legged stool, ladies and gentlemen. And this is very important because you are able to describe organizations, processes, teams, and individuals in that particular organization, ladies and gentlemen. So why don't we now turn to approaches, to operationalizing theories, right? What are those approaches that are at our disposal to try and operationalize theories? It's not a very simple thing, but not difficult either. It can be done. There are distinct approaches to theory operationalization, and three core approaches are presented in this lecture to illustrate the variation. And of course, aligning with the key research strategies that were discussed earlier on, we come up with the following perspectives, we come up with the following theories. And one of them, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call aligning with the key research strategies that were discussed earlier. And these approaches are certainly quantitative approaches. and these are qualitative approaches, and they are mixed methods approaches. So these three, the qualitative, the quantitative, and the mixed methods, are very important when we want to operationalize these things here. And an important point when it comes to operationalization is that the approaches are more discrete, and it can be difficult to combine, ladies and gentlemen, operationalization strategies into a mixed methods approach. But that does not mean that it can't be done at all when you are trying to consider the philosophical assumptions, right? Again, as I said earlier on, depending on the worldview that you are using, if you want to use the mixed methods, and you know that you have philosophical assumptions that must be brought into the thing, you have the two extremes, right? Of course, the quantitative and the qualitative, and the assumptions are totally different. But of course, there are those who have advocated for coming to the midpoint where you have the quantitative and the qualitative being mixed, ladies and gentlemen. So the key is to fall back and continuously revisit the purpose and intended outcome of the theory building effort, so that you choose an approach that is probably more convenient, whether you're going to use, not even convenient, but the one that will give you proper results for rigorous testing. So whether qualitative or quantitative or mixed. Now, of course, the other aspect that you must consider is the intention of the theory, right? Is the theory intended to explain a phenomenon, and what kind of phenomenon, and how does it work in this perspective? And these are things that you must consider. And if the theory is going after anomalies to already established theories, or you want to really come up with a new effort to try and come up with a new theory that describes the perspectives and the novel phenomenon, then you must consider these various approaches at our disposal. And of course, another drive or another driver here, ladies and gentlemen, is the type of a theory that you want to come up with. Are you thinking about the grand theories? Are you thinking about mid-range theories? Or you are talking about local theories? So grand theories, by definition, will have far and wide boundaries, as we have already said, and generalizability is desirable for these theories, and a quantitative approach may be best suited for the task, ladies and gentlemen. While at the same time, if you are thinking about local theories have a much smaller domain of application, and the purpose is not prediction or generalization. So in such cases, the theorists may only need to establish propositions. And of course, in this case, if you're talking about mid-range theories, right, and mid-range theories will be a philosophical no man's land, in which the purpose of the theory building effort is even more important. So in mid-range theory building, the theorist must clearly, ladies and gentlemen, clarify and describe how potentially competing assumptions were resolved, because in many cases you have competing assumptions. And for mid-range theories, this is so because the assumptions for the grand theory are totally different from the assumptions of the local theories, and the mid-range theory falls in between there. So the opposing assumptions are likely to pose a challenge to the theorists, and therefore you must really think about this. And of course, this is very important. So anyway, again, remember that other things will include case studies and grounded theory studies, which can be used to work best when both quantitative and qualitative approaches are used. And remembering that grounded theory uses data to generalize propositions, and of course this does not actually require that they be formally tested, ladies and gentlemen. So the general method of theory building in applied disciplines being presented here in this lecture does not require formal confirmation, ladies and gentlemen. And again, decisions here must be connected to the initial purpose for building the theory and its intended use, with an ultimate goal of assessing its fit with the real world, ladies and gentlemen. So at the end of the day, these two must be related. So in summary, we have found two critical drivers of theory building processes: the purpose of the theory building process, the purpose of the theory building, and the boundary of the theory. And of course, this is very important. Right, let's just take an example, and we have a few examples here that we shall be looking at. But let's take an example of sending flowers, right? So suppose we were to operationalize the effects of sending flowers to recovering patients with the goal of increasing health. The core question is how we would measure the proposed increasing health of patients. So how easy is it for us to really do this? Now, of course, you can see the operationalization here could be in terms of looking at variables that bring out this variation, maybe shorter hospital stays, and this is measured by number of days spent in the hospital, or you look at the heart rates and blood pressure as measured by beats per minute, and diastolic and systolic pressures, ladies and gentlemen. And maybe even increased morale is something that you can look at, which can be used by measuring, it can be examined by using measures such as attitude. In other words, you ask questions about the attitude of the fellows, the outlook, and emotions. And generally, these are some of the things that you find in the works of Wenel to 2011. Right, so let's now look at the qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods very, very fast so that we understand. We start with the quantitative approach. The quantitative approach to operationalization will be, or seems to be, very familiar to many of you listening to me, because this is the preferred approach and probably the most common approach to operationalizing theories, which involves the use of propositions, empirical indicators, and hypotheses, ladies and gentlemen. So the outcome of the operationalized phase are confirmable propositions, confirmable hypotheses, confirmable empirical indicators, and confirmable knowledge claims, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, as I said earlier on, knowledge is justified true beliefs. And these are claims, by the way, for individuals to claim that they know. That means there must be justification of their beliefs, right? And these beliefs must be true. So justified true beliefs. So the quantitative view of operationalizing theory specifically includes propositions, as I've already said, empirical indicators, hypothesis as the remaining steps in Dublin's theory building process. So why don't I take you through propositions? And incidentally, we have already gone through this. I don't even know whether I should spend too much time talking about propositions. As we saw earlier on in the earlier lectures, actually, right from our first 4 lectures, right? And the 2 lectures, actually, it was, I think, from lecture 5 and lecture 6. Right, in lecture 5 and lecture 6, we talked about propositions. Right, and you see here that propositions introduce the idea of prediction into the theory building equation. And a proposition may be defined as a truth statement about a theory when the theory is fully specified in its units, laws of interaction, boundary, and system states, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, when we summarize this concept of proposition, we have what we call truth statements about the theory when the concepts have been defined, and that's very important, organized and bounded, and essentially the natural consequence to what the conceptual development phase would produce. Now, of course, the term logical consequence is a good substitute for the truth statement in this case, because the important point in specifying propositions is to continue the clear logical path set up by the theory builder from the start, ladies and gentlemen. So, the use of the terms logical consequence, truth statement, or proposition is simply to establish the consistency of the theory of the builder's logic, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, it's quite important because quite simply, the use of the theory is to generate predictions, to make truth statements about the theory in operation. So as a result, propositions are prediction statements because they state what will be true having completed the work of the conceptual development stage or phase. So let's now look at empirical indicators, and we now know what they are because I've been talking about them. An empirical indicator is an operation employed by a researcher to secure measurements of values on a unit. Remember, when we start talking about units, we are talking about concepts. So you must have an empirical indicator, right? An operation that you are going to employ as a researcher to secure measurements of values on a particular unit. So empirical indicators are measurements using some kind of instrument, right? And of course, in this case, the issue of operationism is important, which again draws from the works of Bridgman, 1922, and Bentley, 1954, which certainly highlight the focus on setting up empirical tests for the propositions. And for Dubbin, operationalism is referred to as specifically, right, test out these propositions, right? We look at empirical testing of the propositions at this material time. And empirical indicators must produce reliable results, right? And that's why the concept of validity and reliability becomes very important. And more specifically, values that do not differ from observer to observer. So we shall always be asking you to validate your results, right? Tell us, what is your validity index? Tell us your reliability index. So can we talk about validity and reliability in this case? So the phrase as measured by, in most cases, that you'll find in the literature, somebody will tell you, I adapted scales developed by, right, is common. This kind of phrasing is commonly used to describe the empirical indicator used in subsequent research. And in fact, somebody is telling you that these have been tested in a certain areas and environments and settings, and the results have been found to be valid and reliable, ladies and gentlemen. So that's why there are two types of empirical indicators where we have what we call the absolute and the relative indicators. And ladies and gentlemen, absolute indicators are obsolete in the sense that there can be no question as to what they measure, right? And an example will include race and gender, right? And these are examples of absolute indicators. But we also have relative indicators. And these are indicators that may be employed as empirical indicators of several different theoretical concepts, right? As articulated by Dubbin, 1978, page 195. So the relative indicators, ladies and gentlemen, are often concepts that can be described in relative degrees, such as happiness, satisfaction, or level of. Let's now go to hypotheses, right? Hypotheses are the predictions about values of units of a theory in which empirical indicators are employed in the named units, ladies and gentlemen. And hypotheses establish the link between the empirical world and the theory that has been under construction. And researchers often state hypotheses without supplying the scientific path to that hypothesis, which sometimes gives the impression that hypotheses are constructed on an ad hoc basis. But ideally, as you can see, hypotheses should not be ad hoc at all. Rather, they are predictions of the values on units that are derived from a proposition about a theoretical model, ladies and gentlemen. And each proposition has the possibility of being converted into many hypotheses. Now, the general rule here is that a new hypothesis is established each time a different empirical indicator is employed. And as the number of propositions increases, ladies and gentlemen, so does the number of possible hypotheses. And ultimately, the question of number of hypotheses has been coming up in the research that is undertaken by the masters and possibly PhD students and so forth. So the question of number of hypotheses, a question of, and I must say at this material time that this question, of course later on I will give you a different answer, but the question, right, or the number of hypotheses is a question of research preferences and the energy posed to a discipline and its researchers, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, later on, I'll be telling you that you shouldn't, especially when we look at the concept of parsimony and operationalization, I'll be telling you that, you shouldn't have too many of these hypotheses, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, as you can see, again, I'm giving you another perspective that the question of number of hypotheses is a question of research preferences and the energy posed to a discipline and its researchers. So let's look at the qualitative approach. Now, qualitative approaches to operationalizing, ladies and gentlemen, the qualitative approach to operationalizing theories demand alternatives to hypothesis testing. Whereas in the quantitative, you are using hypothesis. Here, you are not using hypothesis. So generalizability is not always the goal of theorizing at this material time. So many qualitative researchers substitute the term transferability and generalizability. Now, while generalizability is a characteristic, ladies and gentlemen, of the theory itself, transferability to the consumer's ability to use and transfer portions of the theorizing to his or her context and situation. So transferability. And that's why we've been talking about adopting and domesticating theories to suit your environment. So you can actually pick ideas from and theories from different disciplines and use them to build or develop knowledge in your areas. So cross-disciplinary fertilization is an approach that has been adopted by researchers, especially during this time. So a broad approach to operationalizing theories is therefore useful in qualitative methods in theory building. And such methods, ladies and gentlemen, can include, for instance, grounded theory, social construction, phenomenology, case studies, among many others. Now, while we have simplified this discussion in this lecture by categorizing all of these in the qualitative domain, it is important to note that each specific method may have distinct theoretical assumptions, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore you must be conversant of this. A falsification, right, ladies and gentlemen, is presented as the core alternative to traditional approaches testing, in this case, traditional hypothesis testing. So we can see that from literature, early criticism of positivism resulted in the notion of falsifiability, and that's really from the works of Popper, 1972, ladies and gentlemen. So falsifying or falsifiability refers to the possibility that a given hypothesis or theory could be shown as inaccurate. The classic example used to illustrate falsifiability is the statement that all swans are white. And this statement is falsifiable because it is possible that a non-white swan could be found. And the essence of falsifiability is to search for cases in which the theory does not operate as expected, and that's the black swan. So falsifiability then is unique because instead of looking for empirical evidence to confirm the adequacy of a theory, it looks to show its inadequacy in this case. So therefore, statements must be falsifiable in order to be testable, ladies and gentlemen. So let's take another example. The statement that flower is beautiful It is not falsifiable statement because it is impossible to assess technically. And Popper 1933 explored two kinds of statements that are useful in considering knowledge with regard to falsifiability. And of course, these are observational, and the second one is categorical. And observational statements simply report the existence of things, where you say, there is a black cat, right? There is a white cock, right? There is a white goat, there's a white cow, that kind of thing. So these are what we call observational statements, right? Now, categorical statements aim to categorize all instances of a thing, like when you say, all cats are black. So you go into this categorization, right? Of course, you can use the set theory, or you can use even other indicators that you think are very important at this. So in this case, few observations are required in the case of cats to conclude that not all cats are black. And therefore, that's what it is. So in complex organizations and human activity, observational research can be difficult to set up, it can be difficult to control, and can be difficult to analyze, and can be difficult to replicate, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just give you an example of team building, right? Team building is a good example. Tuckman, 1965, theorized that all teams must go through a certain process. So Tuckman talks about forming, right? He talks about storming, talks about norming, and talks about performing, ladies and gentlemen. So the traditional approach, ladies and gentlemen, would be to investigate these phases in numerous teams. So in other words, you go and look for the existing teams, right? And then start examining whether these things exist there, right? So you investigate these phases in numerous teams, collecting evidence that supports a hypothesis with the goal of showing that all teams transition through these phases. They transit through these phases. Now, the falsifiability approach would seek cases of teams that do not show evidence of all four phases and investigate why. And any incidents in which a team did not show evidence of all four phases would be enough to disprove Tuckman's theorizing, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, philosophers of science continue to debate how and under what circumstances it is appropriate to move from observational to categorical statements, and isn't easy. And that's why you have pragmatic logic versus arcane philosophical angst. And of course, that should probably help us to rule the decisions, ladies and gentlemen. So the utility of the utility of falsifiability is then in its opposite approach, right? And needs to be examined fully at this material time because we need to use data to support the hypothesis. But some of the hypotheses cannot easily be, but of course we must try to test those hypotheses. Now, falsifiability can, but is not required, ladies and gentlemen, to develop propositions, empirical indicators, stopping short of hypothesis in some cases. So as you can see, falsifiability emerged in part as a reaction to the scientific method and attempted to identify its limitations. So the greatest utility of falsifiability as an approach to operationalization is in local theories that may not include hypothesis at all. For example, in the social construction orientation, theories are intended to describe, so hypotheses may or may not be used. In the case they are not, falsifiability gives the theorist a way, ladies and gentlemen, to indicate how the adequacy of the description is to be judged. And therefore, falsifiability is more appropriate for local theories and cases in which the theorist does not seek to generalize findings to other domains. Right, let's go to the mixed methods approaches. These most often mixed methods include case study, grounded theory approaches to theory building, extra. So as you can see, these approaches, ladies and gentlemen, use a variety of methods to approach the theory and research purposes defined from the start. So if you're using qualitative, again, and you're going to mix it with the quantitative, you must tell us exactly what your philosophical orientation is, what you intend to gain at the end of the day, right? And all this is very important. I will not really spend too much time on this aspect of mixed methods, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, these are things that we shall be talking about later on in research methods. Right, when we talk about grounded theory, the general steps of grounded theory building include, ladies and gentlemen, initial research, as you can see, select the data, initiate data collection, analyze the data, and conclude the results, right? And on the surface, this process is quite linear, yet a core feature of grounded theory is that all things are integrated at all times in the search of pattern, always integrating these particular aspects. So it's very important for us to know the core feature, right, of grounded theory. And that's why I'm telling you a core feature of grounded theory is that all things are integrated at all times in the search of patterns, always integrating and always in motion. And this is what Glaser 1992 articulates. Now, for sure, once a rim or domain is brought into focus, the act of operationalizing actually gets carried out by analyzing the data obtained from observation. And from the ongoing data collection, observations are the basis for analysis and the theory generation, ladies and gentlemen. So I think I may not be able to go through everything, right? But with the grounded theory, you need also to remember the fact that at the point of saturation of data, the theorist moves on to fully document the final theory, including operationalization and the other 4 phases of conceptualization, that is confirmation, application, and refinement that I showed you in figure 1, and which I've continued to show you, ladies and gentlemen. So the general elements of the case study approach to theory building are to determine the research questions, select the cases and data gathering analysis techniques, prepare to collect the data, analyze and evaluate the data. So if you're talking about case studies, and then those become very critical, and you end up with developing a report. Now, with these generic elements, it is easy to see that the case study approach can accommodate any or multiple specific techniques within this framework. And the case study approach are wide-ranging, and the concept of a case as we know it, or a case study or case study research are different and often inappropriately used interchangeably, ladies and gentlemen, in research by various scholars. But one major role of cases is to describe the how question, right? Case study research studies can certainly contribute to the conceptualized phase of theory building. Ladies and gentlemen. So the operationalization phase is very important. So we'll now discuss the integrative operationalized phase of theory building in applied disciplines. And I am going to present to you figure 3 as you see it on the screen here, because figure 3 presents a summary of the ideas that I'm going to discuss in the next 10-20 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. And as you can see from this diagram, figure 3, operationalized phase, as I told you, the inputs, not the inputs, but the outputs of the conceptualized phase actually become now the inputs of the operationalized phase. So we saw under the conceptualization phase that the outputs would include, for instance, a model or a system or what we called a set of linked concepts, right? And these are now the inputs for the operationalized phase. So at this level, we are ready to go through the process. As you can see, the operationalized phase, ladies and gentlemen, takes us through a number of stages, and these are phases, really. Number 1, you describe the propositions of the theory, as you can see from the diagram here. describe propositions. 2, ladies and gentlemen, describe the results, indicators of the theory. And of course, 3, ladies and gentlemen, develop the research questions of the theory. And after that, we go to the outputs that we shall have. Now, the outputs, again, will become the inputs into the next phase, ladies and gentlemen. So why don't we briefly go through the phases as we have just described them here. So let's go through number 1, step 1, describe the propositions, right? Ladies and gentlemen, for any theory, propositions must be described. Now, the purpose of propositions is simply to extend the theory into the real world by creating statements of its natural outcomes. And the propositions identify the expected outcomes given the construction of the set of concepts. Now, do not forget, I think at this material time, I should remind you what I said in our lecture 5 and lecture 6 on theory building. I told you that there is a difference between a proposition and a hypothesis. I hope you still remember. I told you that a proposition, of course, is a statement that attempts to link concepts together. Now, if you are able to turn those concepts into variables, right, then you develop what we call hypotheses. So hypotheses come from propositions. But once in a while, ladies and gentlemen, as I said earlier on, there could be a mix-up of the two where a hypothesis becomes a proposition and vice versa, especially if you look at concepts at the level of a variable, ladies and gentlemen. So in this case, propositions identify the expected outcomes given the construction of the set of concepts. And therefore, truth statements, logical consequences, and natural outcomes are all terms that imply the same idea at heart, which is to bring the theory into empirical reality, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, propositions are completely appropriate for grounded theories or case studies and social construction orientation towards theory building, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, propositions commonly take the form of if, right? If you're going to have propositions, then do not forget the if, right, perspectives coming in there. So they take the form of if statements or if then, right, if then statements to connect the set of linked concepts to an outcome. And a variety of sample propositions follow. Let me just give you an example of some of these propositions, ladies and gentlemen. You may have a proposition that if gravity is truly a natural law, mark the word if gravity is truly a natural law, then time, right, time, an object is related from the air, right, or time an object is released from the air, right. Whatever you want to really come up with will certainly relate to the time it arrives on the ground, ladies and gentlemen. So, but if you want to really state, you have the if, as I've already said, and then. If gravity is truly natural, right, if it is truly a natural law, then every time an object is released from the air, it will move towards the ground. So that is an aspect that is very important. And of course, the other statement you could have, again a proposition, is that if we increase the managers' pay, then their productivity will increase. So you have the if and then. If employees receive increased structured learning opportunities, then their engagement in the organization will increase. So those are examples of propositions. So propositions can follow the logic of the theorist from the conceptualized phase into the real world by describing the perception and behavior changes that would be required to indicate the theory is working, ladies and gentlemen. So if this one happens, this one also happens. So propositions are very important, and therefore propositions can arise from the other phases, which though connected do not follow a linear path in this case, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go to the next stage, and that is describe the results. Again, from the diagram that you have here on the screen, you say the first one is describe propositions, the second one is describe the results indicators. Now, results indicators extend propositions by adding the measurement piece. In other words, results indicators introduce the measurement instrument or confirmation criteria into the theory building process. So, the core work of describing results indicators is in becoming familiar with existing evidence or measure of the expected results. Therefore, operationalization becomes very important because we must actually search for, we must locate, we must review, we must compare the existing ways of assessing concepts into a particular theory by using, of course, the already existing knowledge. And if you do not have those indicators, ladies and gentlemen, it's better you engage in what we call the theory building process. And once you do so, you'll be coming up with those particular ideas that will help you conceptualize and operationalize. Our concern here is operationalizing, being able to measure these things, ladies and gentlemen. Now, allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to take you to step number 3, which you can see on the diagram here, which is developing research questions, ladies and gentlemen. And in this perspective, the development of research questions is the final step in connecting the theory to the empirical world, right? So after you've come up with the propositions, you'll have the hypothesis, right? Then the research questions become very important. And research questions are a natural bridge into research design and the next phase of theory building, ladies and gentlemen, which is the confirm phase. And furthermore, research questions specify the activity under inquiry and may reveal some of its underlying assumptions. And as you can see, they also often identify unexpected relationship or relationships among 2 or more variables, ladies and gentlemen. So research questions also add a high level of specificity to theory building. So it's important for us to start thinking about research questions. Theories are broader and more encompassing than models. You know that very well. And models themselves can be highly complex and involve numerous relationships. So, developing research questions forces the theorist to pass, and that's really to analyze out specific manageable portions of the theory. So you'll be able to tease out, right, or pass out these relationships. In other words, research questions are not likely to cover a whole theory. They are like pieces in a puzzle, ladies and gentlemen. And there are usually too many relationships in a theory for a single research study, right, or set of research questions or research question to address. And this is why theory building, ladies and gentlemen, usually results in a program of research that may span a long period of time, ladies and gentlemen. So let's go back to our diagram here that we have on the screen, and the last phase that we see there is outputs. And ladies and gentlemen, as I go through the outputs here, we are coming towards the end of our lecture, and I hope you've actually enjoyed and you continue to enjoy the lecture. So what are these outputs of operationalized phase? As you can see on the screen here, outputs from the operationalized phase are confirmable propositions, confirmable hypotheses, confirmable indicators, and confirmable knowledge claims. And therefore, a theory without these elements does not constitute a theory, because there would be no way to judge its accuracy in describing or explaining some instance of human activity. Right, so that is very important, and let's now look at the summary of the steps. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the operationalized phase involves 3 steps, as we have already seen: describing propositions, describing empirical indicators, and developing hypotheses, which you have already seen in phase 3, in a figure 3, not phase 3, but figure 3, which is still on the board here on the screen. So these 3 activities connect the theory to the empirical world by specifying how it will be judged. And operationalization is traditionally thought of as a purely quantitative approach to defining expected outcomes and research hypotheses. However, we have seen an increase in the use of operationalization concepts such as hypothesis in a variety of philosophical orientations, making the idea of confirmation criteria more widespread and flexible, ladies and gentlemen. So let's look at the quality indicators for the operationalized phase as we move towards the end of our lecture. And I will say there have been no published criteria for assessing operationalization efforts, and scholars have not made clear what successful or well-done operationalization looks like, ladies and gentlemen. However, some indicators have been proposed by some scholars and as logical and useful for judging progress in this phase. And these are described here with the specific application to operationalization work, ladies and gentlemen. So the criteria that we're going to look at for assessing the propositions, results indicators, and research questions, here there are about 3 which are scattered in literature, but you can actually pick any journal article on theory building and try to articulate these issues. The first one, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call the propositions. As I've already said, the 3 general criteria can be applied to the propositions, results indicators, and research questions. And these are 1, parsimony, ladies and gentlemen; 2, the quality and track record of measurement instruments, right? So look at the quality of the measurement instruments and the track record of measurement instruments. And then the specificity of the research questions. So these 3 can be used to measure the quality of the operationalization level of theory development. So why don't we begin with the parsimony so that we understand parsimony very well. Now, parsimony as we know it is a useful criteria in all of the theory building phases. In fact, as we saw in the conceptualization, we had parsimony, and operationalization we have parsimony. As we go to the next level again, parsimony will come up, ladies and gentlemen. So as you can see, this concept of parsimony is very important because when we use parsimony to assess the operationalization phase, ladies and gentlemen, we mean that we must have a minimum number of propositions, we must have a minimum number of results indicators, and a minimum number of research questions, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, while at the same time including the various relationships of the concepts that you may have developed at the conceptualization level up to the operationalization level, ladies and gentlemen. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, it is now clear that as the number of propositions and empirical indicators increase, so do possible hypotheses. And ultimately, the number of hypotheses that you should have in your study, in your project, ladies and gentlemen, depends on the energy of the researcher. Now, but for the sake of designing clear and concise research studies, hypotheses should be kept to a minimum, ladies and gentlemen. So parsimony applies particularly when thinking about designing manageable research studies that are coherent and bounded. So if you look at a model that has been developed and it is crowded with the variables and so forth, I mean, the model is not parsimonious at all, right? And of course, any theory of applied human activity is likely to be complex. We know that very well, but we do not, again, have to crowd the models. And these theories involve certainly more hypotheses than a single research study can hold, but we need to be very careful about this. So the second indicator that we talked about was the quality and then the track record of measurement instruments. Now, again, remember, from the conceptualization level, where you come up with a theoretical model and conceptual model, you go to what we call the operationalization, right? And of course, at this level, you are dealing with measurements. We look at the quality and the track record of these items, especially if you are dealing with concepts that have been measured over an extended period of time by different scholars in different disciplines or even in the same discipline. So using measurement instruments in applied disciplines, ladies and gentlemen, raises the issues of validity and reliability to the top of the list, right? And validity and reliability are extremely important because they provide a sense that the instrument scores, right, are accurate and consistent. We want to have those scores. We want to have those items that are accurate and those items that are consistent. Now, though it is good practice to report validity and reliability of scores in research studies, a surprising number of researchers, ladies and gentlemen, rarely solely, right, researchers certainly rely on the measurement items developed by previous scholars. Don't forget that. So although it is important for us to develop our own instruments, right, but in most cases, because you are not really generating a new concept, the concept has been there unless it has been misunderstood over time, and you want to reconceptualize your items, your measurements, your operationalized items will certainly rely on the previous studies that have been conducted by previous scholars, ladies and gentlemen. So instruments with the long histories of use and repeated demonstrations of valid and reliable scores in a variety of contexts inspire confidence and lend to the quality of operationalization. Newly developed instruments tend to raise a variety of questions as they simply do not have established track records. So, ladies and gentlemen, when choosing instruments to measure the expected characteristics, the history and background of the instrument is an important consideration. So these are very important things, ladies and gentlemen, and we must always consider those aspects. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to conclude and end our lecture here, ladies and gentlemen, and then I will certainly try to invite you to our next lecture, ladies and gentlemen. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, this lecture has presented the operationalize phase. So existing strategies for operationalizing theories were reviewed that illustrate the concept of operationalizing theories from a variety of perspectives. Again, the general operationalize phase was described with these three major steps being describe the propositions, describe the results indicators, and develop the research questions. And each of these steps, ladies and gentlemen, was described with examples, and I hope you still remember those examples from a variety of theoretical perspectives, showing the utility of connecting to the ideas developed in the conceptualized phase to assessment strategies in the real world context, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite you for our lecture 11, and lecture 11 will be our next lecture, and the next lecture will describe the confirm phase, which requires the theorists to gather evidence of a theorist's fit with the world in which it is expected to operate. Welcome, and thank you very much for attending this lecture, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank you very much and wish you a nice time. Stay well, stay safe. I wish you a nice time. Bye.